I'm going to talk to you tonight about a herb or a tree which is well known to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. I'm going to go through a little bit about the tree itself and how it's grown and where it grows and its compounds. I'm going to take you through the history, starting very early in the history of European colonization of the Americas. And I'm then going to talk to you about how sassafras was imported into Europe, how important it was during the early part of the 17th century, and how large that business became. I'm then going to talk to you a little bit about how it was used through time and how it fell from grace and the reasons behind that. So talking about the tree itself, it's of the laurel family, and the laurel family also includes bay, cinnamon, avocados. It's called sassafras or white sassafras, sometimes red sassafras or silky sassafras. And it's native to the eastern side of the northern part of the American continent. It's a dioecious tree, which means that it requires female and male flowers in different trees to be fertilized by insects for fertility, and it grows to what is described as a mid-sized tree, up to 20 meters in height and a canopy of about 12 meters. All parts of the tree are aromatic. So the leaves, the bark, the root, all have a very pleasant, spicy smell. It reminds one somewhat of cinnamon or vanilla with a little bit of citrusy smell in it. And if you walk through sassafras groves or trees and brushing the leaves, you will smell this wonderful smell. It's quite distinctive. This is a picture of the plant during autumn and its autumn color. You can see that it's got quite distinctive trilobed leaves. Although in some trees, in fact, most trees, you'll also see, if you can look in your top left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see bilobed and unilobed leaves as well. And all of these forms appear on trees, and it may be the same tree that has multiple forms. The majority of the forms, however, are this trilobed, rather attractive shaped leaf. If you look in the background of this slide, you can just see the bark of the tree. And the bark is a reddish-brown colour with deep grooves. The grooves and the ridges getting deeper as the tree ages and grows. This is where it's found. These are the states of the mid part of the American continent, mainly the east side. If you see where the greatest amount of the trees grow, that underneath that, those heavy dots, is Kentucky. Above Kentucky is Ohio, and up by the Great Lakes you've got Michigan. But it does grow all the way up the eastern seaboard towards the northern part of Massachusetts, almost getting to the Canadian border, and down to the upper part of Florida. And this is where the tree grows most plentifully. It does not grow well in dry and other parts of the American continent. I think it's useful to go back and remind ourselves of the history of the colonization of the Americas. I like using this map. It's a very beautiful map, which is actually owned by the American Museum in Bath. You can just see the little, there you go. You can see their logo. And the American Museum in Bath have used this map and are currently using it in a display of maps, an exhibition that they're holding. This is a map it's a woodcut, hand-painted map by the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller, painted and designed and painted in 1513. And it shows the very early visions of what the Americas looked like. The islands that you see in the middle, those are the Caribbean. And that little bit that sticks out next to the island at the top, called Isabella in the map, that's the southern tip of Florida. So when Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492 from, you can see up there, Spain. I'm sorry, the scale is slightly off, but he set sail from Spain and he landed probably first in the Bahamas. He then skirted along the Caribbean islands until he got to the island he called Hispaniola, which we now know half of which is Haiti and the other half is the Dominican Republic. The island above it that you see there, Isabella, that's actually Cuba. So he landed in Hispaniola and he explored that part of the northern part of the island, and he left some of the sailors behind, realizing that he needed additional funds and additional manpower in order to explore further. He sailed from Spain at that time with 3 ships. He returned with 2 ships, leaving one grounded at the northern part of Hispaniola with some of the sailors there. But he was convinced he had arrived in India, and he thought he'd found a new and better route for the spices to come back to Europe. But he required extra funding, so he went back to see Isabella and Ferdinand for this extra funding, and then he sailed back again some years later with a larger number of ships, up to 17 ships. In fact, Christopher Columbus made in total 4 journeys back and forward to the Caribbean islands. In 1498, he returned again and was made governor of Hispaniola. Now, the people that lived, the indigenous people that lived in those islands and also in the southern tip of Florida, are probably one people. There were a people called the Taino, culturally, linguistically related. They may have been warring tribes within that nation, but they were probably one people. And the Taino people had been there for many, many, many thousands of years prior to the arrival of the Spanish in the islands. So when Christopher Columbus arrived, he was convinced that there was gold and silver in the hills, and he realized that the land was very fertile, and he was convinced that there was great wealth to be made here. He had persuaded Isabella and Ferdinand to give him money so that he could explore and exploit the lands, the people, the flora and the fauna of those islands. And he did too. He did so very much. He was very, very clear in his aim that he wanted to utilize the island and utilize the people of that island. So he enslaved the indigenous people of those islands. When he arrived in 1498 to start his mining and farming operations, it's estimated, and there are a variety of estimations, but the estimations are that the native Taino people numbered between 4 and 6 million people. But by 1508, after Christopher Columbus had been removed as governor due to his cruelty and barbarism, the native population, the Taino people, had dropped to about 100,000. So that's a massive drop in population over about 15 years. And I'm going to show you in the next slide some of the reasons why that is. So this is the understanding of what happened, the to and fro that occurred in the early years of the exploration of the Americas by the European colonists. And you can see that there are a number of items that were not native to the Americas, like these animals, cattle, sheep, pigs and horses, honeybees, citrus plants, coffee beans, none of which were native to the Americas. These were brought over because the idea was that this fertile land would provide great supplies for them, not only to explore further into the American continent, but also to maintain colonies that were there. They exported a number of plants like tobacco, cinchona, from which quinine comes, avocados, obviously tomatoes that we are all well aware of, maize as well, corn, sweet corn. But probably the most successful export from Europe into the Americas were these, and these were diseases. So the diseases that you see there listed, smallpox, influenza, measles, devastated the native population of the Caribbean islands to the degree that illness, sickness was so devastating to them, and the idea of slavery was so devastating to them that actually many thousands committed suicide rather than undergo what had happened to other members of their tribes. So when the numbers that Christopher Columbus could use as slaves dropped to the degree that he could no longer maintain the mining or the farming, He then went, well, the Spanish, not necessarily Columbus, went to the west coast of Africa, and they picked up black slaves on the west coast of Africa and brought them into the Caribbean to take on the jobs that the native indigenous people could no longer do. When you take boatloads of people from one country to another, obviously you have to feed them and water them. And in doing so, you have to take water, fruit, vegetation in butts, and in the butts of water and the fruits were the larvae of the Anopheles aegypti mosquito, the vector for these other diseases that became devastating in the Americas, malaria being primarily one of them, but also yellow fever. Now, the European colonists had some immunity, obviously, to smallpox, measles, influenza, etc., particularly these childhood illnesses. But the native indigenous population had no immunity at all. However, the Europeans and the indigenous people had no immunity to malaria. So these diseases caused waves and waves of outbreak, illness, epidemics, so that the population that was inhabiting the Caribbean islands were completely devastated. So let's think about what the native people did. What were their thoughts around healthcare at the time? On the left, you have a photograph from the early 20th century of an indigenous woman carrying sassafras bark on her back. And on the right, there is a picture of the classical way that the herbs were maintained and kept in the home. For the native peoples of the Americas, spirituality and connection with the great creator was very much a fundamental piece of healthcare. They also used sacred herbs, and the sacred herbs are traditionally thought of as tobacco, sweetgrass, sage, and cedar. Now, those are sacred herbs for the Algonquin, but other nations had different herbs, although those four were probably the core herbs that were used. They undertook smudging and rituals, and smudging is where you would burn the herb, sometimes smoking it, sometimes just burning in receptacles, and the smoke would take your prayers and your wishes up to the great creator, who would bestow balance on the lands around you. Their thoughts were that the life force that kept plants, animals, and the world in balance was the same life force that was within them. So they prayed for balance, and this was their idea behind well-being and health. They also undertook purging, sweating, and purification rites as well. A lot of these themes are similar themes to Galenic medicine that was undertaken in Europe at the time, particularly the religious side of it, as well as the purging, sweating, and purification. The picture at the bottom here, this is a painting, a watercolor painting by John White in 1585. Now, John White was an interesting character. He was an artist, and he was employed as an artist to paint the people that he met, and also to draw maps of the area. And he traveled a number of times to the islands next to Virginia and to the coast of Virginia to make maps around the time of Elizabeth I. And I'll come back to him in a minute later on in this talk. Going on to sassafras itself, indigenous medicinal uses for sassafras are listed here. They would make a poultice from the leaves and the roots and apply to wounds and use it as an antiseptic on wounds. It was used for gastrointestinal upset, particularly used for fevers and agues, or a blood cleanser to bring balance to your body and well-being. But primarily, it was also used as a spring tonic. It was widely used in the states that I showed you earlier, widely used as a spring tonic, or a pick-me-up, if you like, where the new shoots and the roots were made into a tea, and sometimes the bark, the new bark as well, was made into a tea, and this was drunk during springtime as a pick-me-up. There were other uses of sassafras by the indigenous peoples. Powdered root was used as a thickener and as a flavourer, mainly for stews, things like filet or gumbo, which is still produced in the southern states like Louisiana. It was also used as an appetite suppressant for over-fatness, or if you were slightly chubby. Because there's a high concentration of saffrole oil in the wood, up to 9% of saffrole oil, it doesn't rot quickly or easily. It is resistant to insect ingress, and it seems to have some resistance against fungal infections as well. And because of this, it was seen to have magical powers. So amulets were made out of sassafras wood and hung around hung as a necklace. But in addition, the wood was used to make items that would keep you safe. So, for example, beds would be made to keep you safe as you slept, as sassafras seemed to have some sort of magical power to prevent bad spirits, for example. Canoes also would be made from sassafras wood, possibly partly because the oil content made the wood float well, but also to protect you when you were on the water. Because of the lovely smell and the way that it melded better with or well with items that could be made into soap, it was commonly used to cleanse the body as well externally. I think it's useful to understand what was happening in Europe at the time when the botanists of that time were exposed to new plants that were coming in from the New World. This is Nicholas Menardis. Now, Nicholas Menardis was a botanist and a physician practicing in Seville in Spain. And he was absolutely fascinated by the plants that were coming from the New World, to the degree that he would be bribing ship's captains to bring him samples back when he heard that they were going to the Americas. He was also a bit of a businessman and had an eye to the profit. And he wrote a number of books, including this one. This is the English translation of a book that he wrote in 1565, and this arrived in England around 1570, The Joyful News of the Newfound World, wherein is declared the rare and singular virtues of diverse and sundry herbs, trees, oils, plants, and stones. And these books around this time were enormously popular amongst practitioners, popular amongst apothecaries, but also popular amongst the learned people who could read at the time. Herbals and these sorts of books were bringing news of new ideas from the Americas. Now, Nicholas Menardis' findings and his writings about plants, including sassafras, came to the notice of the gentleman that you can see on the left, Sir Thomas Harriot. Now, Sir Thomas Harriot was a polymath. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, an amateur botanist, and he was also a bit of a linguist. And he had heard about the peoples of the Americas, partly because he knew John White, and John White was illustrating the people that he had seen in one of the very early journeys that he'd made to Virginia, to the islands of Virginia. Now, Thomas Harriot was employed by Sir Walter Raleigh to teach his captains how to navigate the seas so that they could arrive safely in Virginia and in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh had been given license by Elizabeth I in order to exploit the lands of Virginia for profit. And he was to exploit the people, the lands, the animals, the minerals, so that she could benefit from the New World. As much as the Spanish and the Portuguese, and to a degree the French, were benefiting from the great wealth that was to be found there, the English wanted to be part of that as well. So one of the primary aims of exploiting Virginia was to exploit the plants, to bring them back and to sell them, hopefully in large numbers, to Europe as medicinal plants. Now, Thomas Harriot was a bit of a businessman as well, and he understood the importance of some of these plants. Now, you might wonder, why were they so interested in a plant like sassafras or other plants from the Americas? What was it about those plants that made them want to go and exploit and bring them back to England in order to sell further to Europe? It wasn't just the fact that it smelt good or that you could make a stew out of it. The reason that they were looking to exploit those plants and bring them back from the New World was because of this. Now, this happened about 1494, 1495, and it was the advent of syphilis in Europe. And it erupted in Europe in around 1495, around the time of the Franco-Italian Wars. And it was always your enemy that gave you this disease. So the French called it the Italian pox, the Italians called it the French pox. Whoever was the other was the cause of the pox. There was a theory at that time, in fact, that it may well have been the sailors and seamen coming back from the exploration of the Caribbean that brought it back. Now, we can debate this, and I can certainly talk about this in questions, but I think there's quite good evidence that the organism that causes syphilis was potentially a genetic mutation of an organism that causes a common disease in hot and humid countries, and that disease is called yaws. But we can come back to that later. On the left here, you can see a painting by Albrecht Dürer, which illustrates the fear and the unpleasantness of syphilis at the time. Above him, you can see some astrological signs and the date 1484. And that's because at that time, the feeling was that it was an alignment of the planets that had allowed this disease to occur. There was no class differentiation. It infected royalty, nobility, and paupers. There was dreadful stigma associated with it, because when you get the later consequences of syphilis, it can affect the bones of the face, particularly the cartilage and bone of the nose, so that your face basically collapses in on itself. So it was a very visible and unpleasant disease. In addition, as you can see from both illustrations, the skin manifestations are very obvious. So at the time, the Europeans were looking to the New World for decoctions that they could use in order to treat this illness, which was felt to have been brought to Europe by the sailors who were exploring with Christopher Columbus. And there is some merit in that theory, because those sailors were mercenaries and they came back to Europe to fight for Charles VIII during the Franco-Italian Wars. So there's certainly a possibility that this is how it was introduced into Europe. They also believed in the doctrine of signatures, which I think you probably all know about, where God has placed a remedy for each disease at the location and the origin of that disease. And also, you might look at the plants that were available, and they might remind you of the part of the body that was infected, such as here with guacum. And in order to treat part of the body that's infected, you might use a plant that looks like that organ, and therefore it would bring some sort of cure to the disease. Now, these are the plants that were commonly used, often mixed, in order to treat syphilis. The middle plant, just fun fact, guacum, or the wood from it, is still used to make the gavel for judges in America. In addition to the sassafras being a plant used for medicinal purposes, it was also used to make a drink called salep or saloup, which was immensely popular. It was sold in the tea and the coffee houses of London and in Europe, and it makes a spicy, citrusy, unctuous sort of drink. It feels a bit like hot chocolate being drunk, and it's very pleasant. And it was incredibly popular during this time. Up until well into the mid part of the 1700s, the exportation of sassafras from the Americas occurred in enormous amounts, tons of the stuff, to the point that it was second only to tobacco for export weight coming out of America. Even in the 1950s, and this is an advert in the 1950s for root beer, build mass with sass. Even into the 1950s and early 60s, it was associated with health and well-being. However, then the slump occurred. Now, the slump in the export of sassafras occurred for a number of reasons. First of all, it was overexploited. The best part of the plant or the tree to use in order to get the highest concentration of saffrole is the root and also the bark or young bark. If you strip the bark from the tree and cut out the roots, you kill the plant. And therefore there was over-exploitation of the sassafras. It's quite difficult to cultivate. It's difficult to grow outside its naturally found environment. So they were unable to grow it in large amounts, certainly not in Europe. There was competition from other agents as well, particularly for the treatment of syphilis. It didn't work. It was found not to be effective. And mercury and other agents that had some efficacy were introduced into the pharmacopoeia at that time. Also, if you were seen drinking sassafras tea in a tea house, questions might be asked as to why you were drinking sassafras. It was associated with syphilis and shame, and therefore the popularity of the drink absolutely plummeted. I think it's worthwhile also us looking at what the biologically active compounds of sassafras are. I'm occasionally asked, does it work? Does it work for anything? Well, there are biological compounds that are active. I'm going to talk a little bit about saffrole in a minute, but the other compounds that are found are eugenol, which is also found in cloves, which has got an analgesic and anti-inflammatory and possibly an antimicrobial effect. Tannins, which are astringent and antioxidant, are also found in sassafras. And sassafrole itself, the oil, the majority of the oil is saffrole oil. Saffrole oil is antioxidant. It does have antimicrobial effects. It's much more effective as a nanoemulsion, and it is active against Pseudomonas. If you've heard of Pseudomonas, it's an organism that can cause a multitude of different infections. It's got some activity against staphylococci, for example, MRSA. It's not brilliant, but it's got some activity. And it's got activity against fungi as well, particularly Candida. So there are effects in the laboratory using saffrole. I think it's important to remember, however, that what goes on in the laboratory does not necessarily occur in the human body as well, which I think you're probably all aware of. I mean, you can find antimicrobial effects for garlic, for example, in the laboratory, but you'd have to eat so much garlic that you would turn into a clove of garlic in order for it to be effective if you were using it as an antibiotic. It does have some activity against laboratory cell lines, cancer cell lines. It is, however, also a carcinogen. And the laboratory experiments in the 1960s identified that it causes hepatocellular cancer in lab rats. And at that point, there was a significant concern around the use of sassafras. So this is going to be my final slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about other side effects and how it's affected people in history as well. And then we can certainly go to some questions. Drinking sassafras tea can make you sweat. It gives you diarrhea and vomiting as well, and hence the purging aspect of it, which the Native Americans used back in the early 1500s when it was first identified as a plant that they used. Because of the hepatocellular potentiation, it's banned as a food additive by FDA in 1960, so that it is no longer used to flavor root beer. It originally did flavor root beer along with sarsaparilla, and in fact, root beer, when it was first made, was alcoholic. During Prohibition, and when it started to be used by or drunk by children, then it was no longer fermented, so that the alcohol didn't become part of it, but the flavor was the same flavorings used. And it was banned as a tea in 1976. However, one thing I would say, if you do go to the Appalachian Mountains, you will find people still making sassafras tea, and you probably can still buy it. I would caution how much you would drink of it, because it does cause apoptosis of neural cells and inhibits neutrophil activity. And the saffrole oil is a precursor for MDMA or ecstasy, which is a class 1 drug in America and illegal. It's also a poison, and as little as 5 mils of pure saffron oil can kill. Going back to its potential cause of cancer, along with tobacco, it was occasionally mixed with tobacco, and certainly 2 of the very early explorers of the Americas probably died of oropharyngeal cancer, including Thomas Harriot and John White, probably because they were using tobacco and imbibing sassafras as well. I think that's all I'm going to talk to you about this evening. It's a bit of a run through and a quick talk about the different aspects and the use of sassafras, and how it was certainly used by Native Americans for hundreds, if not thousands of years, prior to it becoming enormously popular by Europeans, and then falling from grace when it was discovered that it didn't cure diseases like syphilis and it could be harmful. And now, if you want, I'm very happy to take any questions, and I will take my slides down and join the meeting sitting down.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that fascinating talk. And let me just sort out the video now. Excellent. And I can see the little applause symbols going off all over the screen. And I think I asked you before your talk whether you tasted sassafras. And I think in these last few minutes you've done a great job of explaining why not. Now, I think that we have a question already waiting for you. John Wilkins, I can see that your hand is up. You want to unmute, and if you like, yes, excellent, and ask your question.
Thank you for an excellent talk, and I was very impressed with your IT skills, presenting yourself as a wedding lady. I haven't seen that before. Just a couple of clarifications. The first one is, you mentioned the Algonquin. As I understand it, they belong to the northeast American continent, not in the area you were talking about. I wondered why you chose them.
So the Algonquin are the Algonquin as a nation, like many of the Native American nations, had sub-tribes, if you like, in the same way that the Taino did around the islands. But the Algonquin nation were also found down in Virginia, on the coast of Virginia. And it's those people that John White and Thomas Harriot tried to meet and discover. Certainly Thomas Harriot's main aim for ingratiating himself with the Algonquin was to learn their language, and that was so that he could translate for some of the native people who'd been brought back into Europe. And I think that his idea was to understand their culture and their language, and John White was obviously the illustrator.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. The second thing is about guiacum, the lignum vitae.
Yeah.
I've been editing a chapter by a Spanish colleague who has concentrated on that plant and the way that it was used by the authorities in Port Mahon in the 16th century as the principal medication for syphilis, especially among the sex workers of the town. They regulated how this business was working, and it was guiacum they were using. I wonder if you could comment on the comparative use of the two plants, the sassafras and the guiacum.
So yeah, I'm aware that guiacum was used, and actually it was quite common that the medication that they gave to patients was a mixture of the three, sassafras, guiacum and sarsaparilla. But you're absolutely right. It is one of the plants that was tried for syphilis. It may be that sassafras was more popular because it was pleasant to take. I mean, I've never tried guiacum either, but it may be that it was a more popular import because of the the use in teas which people enjoyed, and that's what added to its popularity.
You don't know about the comparative efficacy of each plant?
I can tell you what the efficacy is of each plant is, and that is 0. But why in different populations either plant was used, I haven't looked into that, so I can't really comment. But none of these plants had any efficacy. I mean, what I did find interesting looking at the research around it is that the fact that saffrol is antiseptic. I wouldn't say it's an antibiotic, but it is antiseptic. May well be why it was used for sores and wounds. And so when the native population were using it as a poultice, there may have been some efficacy. Now, they weren't only using it, obviously, against well, it wouldn't have been syphilis wounds, possibly yaws wounds. Then there may have been a healing or a soothing effect. And it might be that the Europeans saw the indigenous people using it in that way and therefore extrapolated that this might be something that would help the wounds and the sores that you got with syphilis.
Thank you very much. Better than mercury, probably.
Well, mercury might have some effect against syphilis, but sassafras, they can both kill you, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, John. Michael, would you like to ask your questions? And you're muted.
Hello. Oh, good. I have a few questions. I guess the first one is if you see these plants as having no efficacy, why do you bother to study them? Because you seem to be quite learned about all the different aspects of them, the uses by the Indians and so forth. So I'm curious about that, number one.
I don't know what sorry, could you just repeat what the question was there?
If you say these 3 plants have no efficacy, which I disagree with as an herbalist, and I would wonder why you would put so much wonderful energy in studying them, because I've learned a lot from your discussion, at least some things. And so that's my first question.
Okay, so making them into a tea, when I'm saying they have no efficacy against syphilis when taken in the way that they were taken.
Well, I agree about that, yes.
Okay. Whether they have a biological efficacy when taken as a tea is a different question, and that's not what I studied. One of the reasons that I found it interesting, partly because I showed you the map in the American Museum, that very beautiful map from 1513. I actually volunteer in the American Museum. And one of the, it's just outside Bath, it's the American Museum and Gardens, a beautiful museum. And when I was started there, I was asked, what are you interested in? And I said, I'm interested in medical history. So they gave me a book to research, and it's a handwritten journal written by an apothecary in 1667. And nobody really knew what this book was about, but stuck in the back page is a prescription from 1706. And it actually has for Mr. Brewster, and the prescription is to make some pills, but with oil of sassafras. And it's in Latin, but these were to be taken one in the morning, one in the evening, and one if feeling very unwell. And I just found this little book absolutely fascinating, this journal. And that's what took me down the journey of looking at the herbs that were used in that time period and by Native Americans. So that's where it all came from. Not because I felt that they actually were effective against infections, but that's the background really for it.
My second burning question is, if you studied the history of sassafras, is there any reports from the native people of toxicity? Because they're obviously the ones that use them.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the problem that we have when we look at the history of anything around that period of time with Indigenous people is there's no written history. So anything that is written down will be written by Europeans, and their interpretation of what was being said might be colored by the view of whether or not they wanted to profit from it. So I think you have to be quite careful when you think about whether or not the indigenous people were describing side effects and what those side effects were. They also obviously were using, the same as in Europe at the time, methods for purging, vomiting, getting rid of bad, as the Europeans called it, bad humors. So those side effects might have been what was desired for what they felt would be the outcome of using that particular herb.
Yes, and those side effects, of course, are most common with the herbs and the procedures used in Europe.
Do you mean with the concentration of it?
Not just sassafras, just their whole general methods of treatment.
Yeah.
In Europe, vomiting, side effects, diarrhea.
But the Native Americans were using those herbs specifically for purging as well. It was part of their process for healing.
Yeah, and then you say there were millions of people alive when Christopher Columbus landed, and very, very few, relatively speaking, after he left, and they were consuming loads of sassafras. Let me just give a little background here. I visited North Carolina, where a great deal of sassafras is used by now the white settlers there, but also by native people and herbalists who have long genealogy in that region. And I visited one herbalist who was very famous at the time, who had literally a whole stack of sassafras root shavings that he made that was like a huge stack, I mean, 5 feet high, of sassafras that he dispensed with a shovel. And so it's widely used there. And is there any reports of people dying from using that much sassafras in that region right now?
I can't answer that question, I'm afraid. I don't know what the current situation is with that. One of the reasons that the FDA banned its use was because of laboratory experiments. And I accept that there are limitations for laboratory experiments when looking at different chemicals and items and how they might act in the body. However, the view was that it is a carcinogen and therefore or potential carcinogen, and therefore something that would not be safe in human consumption. And that's why it was banned in 1960 and then as a tea in 76.
Yes, and of course you must be aware of the native prejudice in American science, pharmaceutical science against herbal usage. And at that time it was particularly fierce. I was one of the pioneers of the new rise of herbalism in America. Michael T. I've written 9 books on herbal medicine, and so I don't disagree with you about its toxicity, because when somebody says they have scientific proof that it's toxic, it scares me no matter how much knowledge I have about actual use. But still, I'd like to get over some of those fears because I know from other previous experience that it is widely used even today, and has been widely used for centuries by native people and other people. So it makes me wonder about the innate prejudice of the scientific model that was being used against herbal medicine in America at the time. And how much
this is the most fascinating aspect of the history of herbalism, but we'll have to set aside for the moment. But it is a really interesting and important point. So thank you, Michael, for that. And Tarquin, you've got, well, a question that really takes the history a little further on. So I think in interest of time, I'll say your question from the chat. So Tarquin has 2 questions. One, did sassafras play a role in American patent medicine, and was it included in the official US Pharmacopoeia at any point?
It was certainly included in the Pharmacopoeia of London in the early 1600s, and it appeared there for some time. And in fact, people like Nicholas Culpeper mention it when he translated the Pharmacopoeia into English from Latin. I haven't studied the early American pharmacopoeias myself, so I can't tell you that, but I do know from the European perspective, it was entering the literature very early on. Does that answer your question?
That's satisfactory enough, yeah. Thank you for this great talk, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, I can just add to that. I've just been checking. We've got about 50 specimens in the Royal Pharmaceutical Society Kew Economic Botany collection, including some sassafras grown in Australia and India. So there have been attempts, of course, to cultivate it, but probably not very many, so probably not economically successful. But it does include 3 specimens from Bushspoke Allen, who were the descendants of Stafford Allen, so very important pharmaceutical manufacturer up until the 60s. And we acquired the contents of their sample room when they were bought out by another company and closed down in the 90s. So these are jars with kind of letter-setted labels, so clearly 1960s onwards. So certainly in some circles in Britain, well, not necessarily for medicinal use, because Bushspoke Allen also supplied the fragrance industry. Sassafras was sufficiently in demand in the UK to be in stock. Yeah. Now, this is a question. Okay, there's a little note here from Graham Tobin. Mrs. Grieve, so very well-known British herbalist in 1930, cites a USP, I don't know what USP is, dose of 4 drachms for the mucilage of sassafras. Graham, do you want to come online and expand on it? From the US Pharmacopoeia. Okay. So certainly
I thought he was talking about a unique selling point. That's the use of USP.
USP is US Pharmacopoeia dose. Okay. So it certainly was around that question of how long these things survived into 20th century pharmacopoeias, which is something Gemma Houghton has done a little bit of work on in her PhD thesis. Is, I think, a really interesting question. Now, Edward's question, I think, might be beyond scope, but we can ask you anyhow, Kim. Edward asks, have recent studies of DNA from pre-Columbian remains helped pin down the origin of syphilis?
I wondered if somebody would ask that question. I think it's a very interesting point. So something happened in the 1490s to the organism that caused syphilis. Something happened. Now, there are a number of diseases, 4 primarily, that are caused by subspecies of the organism Treponema pallidum. One of the infections that occurs in the humid subtropical area of the Caribbean and into parts of mainland America as well, certainly around the time of the early colonization of the Americas, is a disease called yaws, which is also caused by Treponema pallidum. Now, yaws causes a childhood illness where it's a skin-to-skin contact or mucosa-to-mucosa contact, and you get a lesion which looks very much like the syphilitic lesions that you get, or the chancre that you get in the genitals for sexually transmitted syphilis. However, yaws is not sexually transmitted. Yaws is skin-to-skin. My view, looking at the literature that I've read, is that yaws was around and probably infected some of the early colonists or early explorers of the Americas who brought it back to Europe. Now, something happened environmentally at the time that allowed it to change its spots, if you like, changed its behavior. Now, I think we've all heard about the changes that happen with viruses like influenza or COVID that cause outbreaks and epidemics. There's what's called shift and drift of the genetic makeup of the virus. The same sorts of things happen with bacteria, and Treponema pallidum is a bacterium where there are changes in the genotype, and that causes a change in behavior. my view is that there was a change in the behavior of the organism that causes this aggressive syphilis that was around in the 1400s. Now, we don't see that aggressive syphilis today. So whatever was happening in 1490s was devastating. It was causing widespread infection and death. We don't see that so much with syphilis today. Yaws is still around, certainly in poorer countries. And it is not transmitted sexually and doesn't cause what's called vertical transmission. So it doesn't go from mother to fetus, whereas syphilis does. So something happened. And looking at the archaeological remains, if you look at some of the archaeological remains that have been touted as, oh yes, look, syphilis was in Europe at the time, I do wonder if they were actually yaws and not syphilis. Only because where the lesions are found in those bodies are bony lesions, and you do get bony lesions with yaws as well. So I just wonder whether or not there's a little bit of an over-interpretation. What do you think, Ed?
Thanks very much for the lecture and for that discussion. I think the most recent thing I've seen are from archaeological remains from the New World. And there's evidence there of yaws-like disease and possibly, but the numbers of remains are so small that it's very difficult to be certain one way or the other. So I think, you know, we're going to edge at this slowly, and the jury's probably still out. But I learned a lot about yours from your discussion, so thank you for that.
Thank you, thank you. I agree. I think the jury's out. I think it's a very interesting topic. And I think possibly more will be found in the future with better molecular techniques.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I can just refer people to look themselves at the chat for a note on the presence of saffron in various other places.
Yeah, that's true.
Cinnamon and so on. But anyway, Kim, so the liveliness of this discussion shows how much we already enjoyed your talk. We've all learned a lot, and it's like Sassafras. It's a name that quite often pops up. It's very much around, and I would have to say previously entirely ignorant, and now no longer so. So absolutely fantastic talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for asking me. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah. And just to say, then our next talk is in 2 months' time, the 7th of July, Dr. Hilary Ingram from University of Nottingham, appropriately enough, talking about just another shot, boots to chemists in New Zealand and Fiji, another topic that I know nothing about, but look forward to being very well informed about. But anyway, general applause all around, Kim.
Thank you.
I don't know do you have any plans to publish this, by the way?
I have been asked to write a summary and publish it, and it's certainly something I'm looking at. I've been so busy finishing my diploma in history of medicine that I haven't actually got around to writing it up. But it's definitely something I'm looking at writing up, hopefully in the near future, definitely.
Because it certainly would be very suitable for the pharmaceutical historian, amongst many other places. But anyway, thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 months' time. Bye then.
Thank you.